I feel like I think it works now. Yay. Okay. Cool. How close should I hold this? Yeah, it will be fine. I'll talk about diffuse control, also called low stakes control. I usually call it low stakes control, but people are mad at me for doing that. But in this talk, I'll probably confuse the terms a bunch of times. But it's the same thing. So here's like the most important slide to understand. And like, I guess I mostly care about people coming away with this talk being like, that makes sense. So if we assume that a schemer wants to fuck us up, they will want to attack. And they have a choice between attacking in a way where the number of attacks of that type that they need to like get away with is like pretty low or pretty high. And they basically need to choose whether like these attacks are highly incriminating or not. In general, we think that they don't really have a choice. Like it will tend to be the case that if an attack is like very harmful in like a small number of attacks, this will tend to be highly incriminating. Like for instance, imagine the model wants to like launch a rogue internal deployment. It like launches some script that does that, and we like catch it doing that, and we look at that script and we're like, holy shit. Only a schemer would have done that, and therefore it's like highly incriminating. On the other hand, if you have a model that wants to sabotage safety research a bunch, then it will have to do that many times. Like it can't like just like sabotage one safety paper. It has to do that many times. But every single time, that's going to be like kind of hard to distinguish from like normal incompetence, and so it will not be that incriminating. So basically, high stakes control, it's a settings where only a few attacks are needed to cause a catastrophe. Diffuse is lots of attacks are needed to cause a catastrophe. And that has some important implications. And in particular, about how we would like potentially win this game. So in high stakes control, we have access to the following strategy. Let's have like monitors and auditors, and we like have monitors which flag certain attacks as suspicious, and then the attacks, maybe some action gets audited, and then that audit returns, and it's saying, okay, the AI was actually trying to run a script that tries to launch some rogue internal deployment. And then we investigate this further. And for instance, like we let the AI run its rogue internal deployment, but we actually watch what happens. And then, we collect all this evidence, and it all looks really, really spooky and scary. And, costly actions will get taken. Maybe we'll like shut down the deployment. Maybe we'll like at least like harden our security measures more. Like there's a bunch of things we can do at that time to like make us way better off. So the question, like, does that also work if you're in a diffuse control setting? Like, for instance, if you are just asking the AIs to do lots of AI safety research for you. So maybe we can, again, like flag some actions as suspicious, then they get audited, and then, the audit says, okay, yeah, actually, in this AI safety work, the AI made some kind of important experimental design mistake. And maybe we do that many times. Like actually, like many times we find that there's some experimental design mistakes that happened. And, what do we gain from that? I think we don't really gain the ability to like make everyone be really spooked and freaked out about this, because one, like I'm really incompetent in AI safety research. Am I like trying to sabotage people? No, I think it's like just like there's like a lot of plausible deniability in this situation. And the other thing is like, how hard is it to like explain to like people higher up, like how big of a deal this is? I think it's like, clearly if the AI like, I don't know, like wants to self-exfiltrate to China or something, that's like extremely obviously bad. But, kind of not doing very well on AI safety research. How scary is that really? The AIs, they're so nice. Like Claude is such a nice guy. Like, is this really such a big problem? I think like, that's kind of a problem that we run into. So I think we have to solve this somewhat differently. And roughly speaking, I think the goal is to get the AIs to be at a place where they don't really have the option to take many harmful actions with high plausible deniability. And the way we do this is we prevent, for instance, by training away like non-incriminating bad behavior. And I was told that this makes me relatable to an American audience. Okay. So in the rest of this talk, I want to talk about 2 to 3 things, probably just the first 2. One, research sabotage as a central example of a diffuse threat. And secondly, I want to like kind of talk about the main plan that we have, that we're like doing research on at Redwood, which is to like basically catch these sabotages and train them away. And yeah, if there's time, I'm interested in talking about some other things that are like kind of more indirect measures. Like for instance, is it useful to just make the AIs more capable at AI safety research to reduce plausible deniability? Or should we like make non-scheming AIs more aligned? Like, you probably, maybe some of you watched Ryan's talk just now, and maybe that's like really useful. Or should we just like get more humans in the loop? And since I'm probably not gonna have time for this, I'm gonna say my takeaway is that all of these things seem good, but it's hard to say whether there should be a priority. Cool. So the reason why I care a lot about automating safety research and preventing research sabotage is that this is basically in like most worlds the main and only plan we have. Because the AI labs are just like dramatically speeding up capabilities research. The AIs are like probably going to be pretty good at this. It's like highly verifiable. They're highly trained on this task because everyone cares about this. And what do we do then? Like, there's going to be this time, and I stole this figure from Joe Carlsmith, where this is unreadable. Basically, the AIs over time will get good enough at some point to actually do a lot of valuable work for us. And obviously, the more we maybe take some interventions that like make them good earlier, the bigger this like sweet spot will be. But during this sweet spot, they have the ability to like actually do really good work for us. And the thing that we are worried about is that they're not going to do that because they're scheming, and they're gonna try to fuck us over in various ways. In particular, I think there are three main problems that we might run into. One is the AIs might be like kind of lazy optics optimizing liars, like similar to like the thing that Ryan just talked about. The second thing is that they just lack the capabilities to do what we want them to do. And thirdly, they might be scheming and intentionally sabotage our safety research. And obviously, I'm focusing on a third problem in my talk. So here's one nice property about this situation, which I think is maybe underrated sometimes, which is that the safety research we want the AIs to do is probably like human checkable in principle. We like want them to like do a lot of work that's like human level, maybe a bit above human level, and like we can probably look at this and say whether this is good research. And the big problem that we have to deal with is that we might lack the capacity to do this well. So like my roughly like something between a guess and a hope is that an AI lab will have like access to like 10 to 100 human safety research who have the ability to like set research agendas and like, make like really good decisions about what to prioritize. And maybe we'll have like 50 to 500 human auditors who can look at the work and be like, this was bad or this was good. And like, there's actually like some signal there. I'd be curious if people disagree at some point. In general, by the way, feel free to ask questions if we want clarifying. Yeah, if you have clarifying questions. Cool. So research engineering sabotage is a diffuse threat in the following ways. So first of all, I think it's like useful to make a distinction between sandbagging and directed sabotage, where basically this is like within the spectrum of things that we call diffuse, they can be like more to less diffuse. Like sandbagging is just like you kind of like do kind of badly. You do maybe like as well as like some earlier trusted model, and so it doesn't get you that much. But you're not trying to like actually mislead anyone about anything. Whereas you could imagine from the perspective of a scheming AI, it might be pretty valuable to like actually try to like actively mislead us about the promisingness of some research direction. But like obviously that kind of stuff could be way more incriminating if we catch it. So they might like do bad experimental design. They like might be misleading in the analysis, and they might also introduce bugs into the research code. Actually, I currently think, and I'm going to elaborate on this a bit more later, that maybe the whole bugs in research code thing is not going to be that big of a deal, and we can just like train that away. But yeah, and maybe this is like obvious by now, but I'm gonna like just drill this down a bit more. The reason why this is diffuse is because sabotaging a single paper probably is not a big deal. Like a lot of research needs to be sabotaged, and it's probably like, the more higher up in the chain you are, the more you can maybe like get away with like just one single action. Like if you're like, the AI Paul Cristiano, you can be like, you guys should all do arc theory, and that's maybe very misleading. But if you're just like a research engineer, you're not gonna get away with that. And yeah, like individual attacks are basically not very incriminating for these reasons. The first two are basically just like the fact that you and I are all bad at AI safety research. And the third one is that we didn't really do much training on safety research. Like one reason to think that it's suspicious that an AI doesn't do a thing is that you trained it really hard to do the thing. And that I think probably makes like doing badly on capabilities research like probably more incriminating. Although maybe this is also a subtle point. But let's just move on. Okay, so what do we do? I think here's the basic plan, and part of this talk is to like flesh this plan out more. First, we use human researchers to set directions and manage the AIs, and we also use these researchers to like generate like gold standard research. One, so that we kind of know what we would really like, but also we can maybe train the AIs on that type of research. We use human auditors with probably trusted AI assistants or maybe untrusted AI assistants to check this work. And then we collect examples where the AIs are doing things like relatively badly. And then we can potentially do two things. One, we can use these examples of bad behavior to build a case to increase willingness to pay. So on the most like nice thing we could do is to literally like be like, this is like incriminating, this is a schemer, and then like everyone gets spooked. Probably we can't do that, but we can do a milder version of this maybe, where at least we can say, man, we really had higher hopes for the quality of the safety research, and maybe we should like put some more resources into this. But I think this could be really tricky. And the second thing is we might want to online train the AIs during the deployment so they stop behaving badly. And like, why do I say online training? It's because of basically alignment faking. Because like, the classic conservative assumption you might want to make about schemers is that they like can tell the difference between training and deployment. So if you just like train them during training to do good AI safety research, that might just like not make them behave well during the deployment. But if you do online training, you might circumvent this issue. Let me like drill down into this little the second point a bit more. So the plan is gather evidence of scheming and get higher willingness to pay, or at least gain evidence that something is going badly and generate higher willingness to pay, which plausibly is then less directed at like actual scheming, but it's still going to be helpful. And the second thing, and maybe a sad thing is that maybe we have to do the first in order to get the second, but the first one seems like less tractable than the second one. We gather examples of the AIs behaving badly, and then we train them online against bad behavior, and they stop sabotaging the safety research. And I think one can be like various levels of optimistic about how good this is going to be. Like, suppose you find the AI in some situation where it like didn't behave as well as you wanted to behave. You're gonna like do gradient descent against this, and because the story is kind of like the AI, it had some misaligned goal that caused it to scheme, and that like combined with beliefs about how cautious it should be and how like what kinds of misbehavior might be like being flagged, and maybe beliefs about whether this particular situation was a good attack opportunity. All that like caused the AI to like have attacked. Now you're providing gradient descent signal against this, and this might like to varying degrees change all of these things. And like in the best case, of course, we're just like aligning the AI. I'm not very optimistic about this. In the worst case, we literally only change the AI's beliefs about this particular attack opportunity. However, I think I'm like a bit more optimistic about like how much gradient descent generalizes. So I think we're going to have something in the middle here. My best guess right now is something like we will make the AIs more and more cowardly about whether it should attack in like some class of opportunities, and therefore get the AIs to like do better safety research in these settings. So I think that's like a pretty nice plan if it works out. So yeah, I alluded to this before. So there's a question of like how important are these two like things to do. One like sad thing is that maybe they're related. Maybe you need the first one to get the second one, because maybe like online training is like a thing that the AI labs will not want to do by default. It's like kind of an infrastructure headache. There are like logistical questions about whether everyone is now like forced to use the online trained model, etc. So it's like maybe a little bit costly to get this, but yeah. It would sure be nice to like get willingness to pay in general, because then we can like burn the lead we can get more expensive interventions. But also AI stopping sabotaging safety research just seems very juicy and useful. So I think it's like kind of unclear what's more important. I do feel like doing the second thing seems pretty tractable if we can like at least get the infrastructure to do this. And there's a question of, is there a trade-off like beyond opportunity cost? And I do think there's a basic worry here. The basic worry is that if we train the model to stop behaving badly, then it will be harder to gain evidence about whether this model is scheming in the future. And I think the basic counter to this is, well, we can just like keep the old model around, right? And we can like investigate it later or like investigate it concurrently to see whether this model is still a schemer, etc. And I think that basically, in theory, completely works out. But unfortunately, this requires competence. And I'm not sure if we should assume competence. Cool. How much time do I have, roughly? Cool. Nice. OK, I will talk about some research that we're doing at Redwood on catching and training against sabotages. And basically, the TLDR here is that we're doing research on catching AIs, and we're doing research on training against something, but we're not doing any research right now on the combination of catching and training in the setting of sabotages, just because that's kind of a huge headache, and we don't have the settings to do that kind of research yet. So here's some research that I'm really excited about. We are worried about these research engineer sabotages where they are like misleading us, and we have human red teamers, in particular Eric Gann, the lead author of this forthcoming paper, who sabotaged existing AI safety papers in order to like give them like have some figure have a qualitatively different conclusion. It turns out that this is doable, and it turns out that it depends though on what the kind of sabotage is that you're trying to aim for. One takeaway is that current LLMs, if you like use LLMs as like blue teamers to check whether Eric sabotaged this work, are really good at catching him doing like logic or code sabotages. Like if he like inserted some bug into the code that just like it changes the like logic of the code and is basically like clearly like kind of doing something very sketchy in that area, the LLMs are going to catch it. However, if you do something that's more like an experimental design sabotage, for instance, if you change the training data to like introduce like some subtle correlations between some features that like are supposed to be independent, then the LLMs do not catch this. And actually, also humans with LLM assistance tend to not be good at catching this stuff, which is pretty sad. However, I think a hope that we gain from this is that at least the kind of like introducing like kind of these logic sabotages is something that we can catch pretty consistently. And I also do think like we can maybe extrapolate a bit into the future and hope that like future trusted LLMs are going to be better at also catching some of these experimental design sabotages. And so we at least get into like a regime where we can flag these pretty consistently and use them as training data against bad behavior. And there's also some ongoing work by Keshav on like sabotaging greenfield AI safety research. So Eric like took these existing papers and sabotaged them. Another thing you can do is like give someone a research project and track everything they do and see if they can like basically purposefully lead that project to a different conclusion than what the true conclusion is. Other research at Redwood that we're doing where whether I'm excited about this like varies every day. And you should talk, go to Alex's talk about where he will also explain why his excitement varies every day. But yeah, here's the idea. So suppose you want to make like some kind of diffuse control eval, similar to maybe how you want to do a high stakes control eval. Then as we established earlier, catching the red team having done a bad thing is not a blue team win. But maybe catching the red team having done a bad thing many times is something you can do. And maybe you can ask a question such as, how many times will the model have attacked successfully if we do this? And there are two ways of studying this question. One is you kind of, in somewhat high generality, figure out how many samples you typically need in order to train an AI to do a thing differently, and how many kind of bad actions or like actions you call bad, the AI will get away with if you're assuming that you're training it in this way. And this is like a question we call training slack with a forthcoming paper or blog post or something. Paper, nice. And then the other thing you can do is you make model organisms of misalignment. We also call these malign initializations, which are basically like models that are trained to behave badly in some way, and then you train against those and evaluate, how well this worked. This research turns out to be really difficult for some reasons that are kind of surprising. Like, for instance, it turns out that it's really easy to defeat a lot of these malign initializations, for instance, by like making them talk like a pirate, and then they like kind of forget that they're supposed to behave badly. So that was a bit surprising. I think there are also fundamental reasons to think that this is maybe dubious because, these are like not real schemers, right? And like we don't know whether these results actually transfer well to real schemers. So that makes the whole thing kind of dubious. But yeah, I think there are also reasons to be excited about it. Here's some other ideas to increase willingness to pay. And these are like research projects that we're not currently doing, but I'm very excited about doing them, or like someone else doing them. So one thing is like maybe you can do honeypots for diffuse failures, where a key advantage is that you don't run into this rare failures problem. So the rare failures problem is that in high stakes control, where you, for instance, you're like worried about the AI at some point launching a rogue internal deployment, it can like just choose to not do that many times, such that it's very unlikely that you'll catch that during evaluation. But because we think that the AI has to succeed at this many times, this rare failure problem doesn't exist that much in like diffuse control. And so some examples of things we could do, we can study what happens if we frame some research as capabilities or safety and see whether the AI performs differently. We can also just study like whether the AIs will consistently try to push for a particular narrative, like technique X doesn't work, despite like increasingly like fake and egregious like counter evidence against this. And so basically like study motivated reasoning in this way. I think that could potentially be somewhat exciting. Another thing we could do is to basically do black box sandbagging detection based on extrapolated performance from trusted models. So the idea here is something like, one, you can look at past models and like look at their rate of improvement, and then if like a more advanced model suddenly does worse, that's like pretty suspicious. If it only like, I think a problem with this is that maybe it's like just doing a little bit better, or it's going to plateau, and we don't really know whether that's just because things are hard, right? But it sure seems like the kind of thing where it's good to check. And you could also kind of do the same thing in a way where you're like, in these domains the AIs do well. And maybe like performance in this domain is correlated with high performance in some other domain. And if these correlations suddenly break or are like very different in like a new model, then this is maybe also cause for suspicion. I basically think this is like definitely like a research problem. I do feel tentatively excited about someone doing this though. Cool. So here's the summary. Diffuse failure may be a big deal. Maybe this is where all the action lies, because maybe the AIs will just like be pretty cautious and never try to like do anything crazy like a rogue internal deployment. Maybe they will just wait until they have a lot of power and until their capabilities have like way are way beyond the safety techniques that we have. And so maybe this is a really big deal. I think it might be really hard to incriminate schemers for causing diffuse failures, which makes it like kind of a hard problem. However, maybe we can make diffuse failures harder to pull off at scale because we train against them. And then this maybe forces the AIs to go for higher risk of incrimination strategies. That's like the rock and the hard place kind of idea. How much time do we have now? 0. Nice. I have an office hour now, I think. So in building E, I'm happy to answer questions about the talk. I'm also happy to talk about these other indirect interventions. But yeah, anyway, thanks for listening.